Today we have a very distinguished guest. She's coming all the way here for a major event about Minnesota Malcolm X conference. We have here Chairman Omali Yeshitela. He is a chair of People's Socialist Party, and he is really has a new book talking about an easy equilibrium, and talking about his theory, or the Sixth Congress, of talking about the people, African nationalism, and it's a very interesting analysis of how the crisis that capitalism is facing, and as he's saying in his book, this is the final blow, the final stage or phases in capitalism, and the solution of eradicating capitalism that was based on exploitation of Africans and colored people. They reach the end of their rope. So we have here Chairman Omali. Welcome, BelAhdan, by the way. BelAhdan means with open arms in Arabic.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Thank you so much. We don't get somebody out of town that often, so we're gonna relish this time with you. And talk a little bit about, since we address a lot about Arab and Middle East, the nature of our show, the nature of being my board, but let's talk a little bit about, I think in part of your book talked about Arab Spring, and that's a revolution which you've been calling on for 50 years, and a revolution is the way to go. But we have all this Arab Spring revolution from Libya, Syria, Egypt, Yemen, and all that. But all of a sudden, Arab Spring became, an Arab fall, and the old power are reclaiming power. And talk us a little bit about the role of capitalism and the role of the West, and especially the United States, in how the setback that's happening in the Arab world now, and what happened to Arab Spring.
Well, I think an error will be made if we look at Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, or the so-called Arab Spring in isolation from everything else that's happening in the world. Because even before there was the Arab Spring, we had the U.S. and various other European powers concerned about what was happening in South America when Hugo Chavez in Venezuela was the one who had to be dealt with. He was the boogeyman. He was the evil one. And then we saw subsequent to that, to Bolivia, Ecuador, and other places throughout Central America, the hegemony of the U.S. in that area is seriously challenged. We see a shifting in the balance of power in the world. And then China becomes this incredible force, the largest, fastest growing economic power, not only in general terms, but in Africa, that's contending with all of the European former colonies in Africa. And then while the U.S. has initiated this horrible war against the people of Afghanistan, Iraq, such murderous brutality in Iraq, where they go in and overthrow a government and lynch the president. They call it a trial, and talking about Hussein. And what happened with Iraq, of course, was a double-edged sword, because while they intended to use Iraq as the means by which they would remake the Middle East in the image of the United States, Europe, the outcome was that Iran, whom they see as this great problem, comes out much more influential and stronger. And the axis of evil that George W. Bush talked about. Now Iran is strengthened as a consequence of what they've done in Iraq. And in fact, it's stronger now than it was before. And so the U.S. is attempting to contend with all of this. It's making mischief in Iran. It has this undeclared war that Israel and the United States is making in Iran has used Stuxnet, the virus, to try to destroy the computer and their nuclear programs, assassinations of their scientists, kidnappings, and things like this that don't make the media that much unless you know what it is that you're looking at and are able to connect it with all the other events that's happening in the world. And what really threw them off, Tunisia was bad enough. And that was a serious problem for them. If you remember France, when Tunisia occurred, France stood united with the Tunisian regime initially.
Yeah, Ben Ali.
Initially. And then Egypt. When Egypt, this massive outpouring of protests against Mubarak in Egypt, that was something that shook them and shocked them, as a matter of fact. Nobody expected that from Europe or from the United States. And it became this overwhelming movement that could not be ignored. It destabilized, as far as they were concerned, all of the interest there. It was a threat to the illegitimate white nationalist settler state of Israel, threatened by the possibilities. Because if the Egyptian revolution had been allowed to continue and mature as it in the trajectory that it was moving, despite the fact that it was terribly unorganized and didn't have a real center, didn't have a real leadership, didn't have a real ideology, but left to itself, there was no telling where it would go. And so the U.S. was quiet. If you remember, for a while it said nothing because it was taken aback by events in Egypt. And eventually, it's clear that this military that they've been given, $1.3 billion a year to for a number of years. In fact,
to be quiet.
To be quiet and to suppress the masses of people. The United States government had an interest in keeping the Egyptian masses under control. That was to secure the Sinai. That was to secure that the canal. So that the military fleets could be there, Israel, to protect their interests there. And everybody sort of knows that Israel is simply a military outpost. It has always been a military outpost for the United States. And so now it's clear that the U.S. intervened in this process and had Mubarak removed from power, if you will. And it was a gentle removal from power. It was a means by which they guaranteed that the masses would not do it. They had the same military they've been supporting stepped in to remove him. And unfortunately, the people assumed that since the police was the immediate direct confrontation they'd had to deal with all along, that the military was their friend. And this was an error. But what has been transpiring is that this shift in the balance of power. And when you understand that what we know as capitalism in the whole world is something that came into existence through slavery and colonialism. It is nothing indigenous to Europe or the white world that somehow that white people would suddenly become so wealthy and powerful. What happened was slavery. And what happened was colonialism. It was Africa, it was colonialism. It divided the entire world and sucking up all these resources and has dominated the world for a long period of time and has spent much of the time keeping things, protecting the status quo. That's what Mubarak's task was. That's what Sadat's task was, to protect the status quo in Egypt. That's what the neo-colonial puppets in South America, protect the status quo. That's why Fidel was such a thorn. Che Guevara was such a problem, thorn in their sides. And then you got somebody like Hugo Chavez. You've got the people in Iraq having the audacity to want to control their own lives. People in Afghanistan having the audacity to want to control their own lives. And when you look at a world where the social and political configuration and economic configuration has been dependent upon this parasitic relationship that the U.S. and Europe have had with the rest of us, so that 80% of the people on Earth try to survive off $10 or less a day. 50% of the people on Earth trying to live off less than $3 a day. This is the status quo that Mubarak was protecting, that the neo-colonial regime in Venezuela and all these other places, they are protecting this status quo.
Well, let's talk about the new indigenous leader that took over after colonial time
Yes.
in the 50s. And they are doing their work. I mean, the Mubarak or Ben Ali or all those people, they are doing to their own people what the colonial white power.
This is neo-colonialism. You know, one thing that I liked about Nasser was the work that he did with Kwame Nkrumah in Africa.
Well, this is interesting. I don't want to interrupt,
right.
but I want to compare Nasser to Sisi, because everybody now in Egypt, not everybody, but the Sisi supported, they said this is the new Nasser, but in fact, Nasser was an African.
No. And in fact, as I mentioned, Nasser worked with Nkrumah, and he worked with Ben Bella, and he worked with a number of folk throughout Africa, and their objective was to unite Africa, And Nkrumah, on 1964, May 24th, 1964, 63, which is the year that the OAU was founded. It was founded formally on May 25th. But on the speech that was made by Nkrumah on May 24th of 1963 in Addis Ababa, he warned, he said, this is what's going to, if we do not unite, we can anticipate the kinds of wars and neo-colonialism, where the imperialists will continue to control Africa by controlling the economy of Africa, so that we'll have indirect rule as opposed to direct rule. Mubarak was the United States still ruling. It was white power in blackface. That's what you find throughout the world today. And when you get someone who challenges this status quo, they kill them. They kill Lumumba. They overthrow Nkrumah. They track down and wound and murder Che Guevara. They kill Thomas Sankara out of. So these are the forces that they eliminate, and then they put forces like Mubarak and Sadat and the rest of them, and who are minding the store for the imperialists. They work for Europe and the United States. They do not work for the masses of people.
When you talk about the African socialist movement or national movement, you're not talking about race or color, or you're talking about a way of thinking, or talking about relation of power between people, because some African or some black people also, they can be the doing for the parasitic capitalism.
Yes, parasitic capitalism. And what we have is, well, there are a number of things that you just mentioned, but one thing for sure is that when the revolutionary movements began during the period that you mentioned, the 50s and the 60s, when we saw the rise of Fidel Castro, and we saw events happening in Kenya, where the Kenyan Land Freedom Army, commonly known as Mau Mau, tried to overthrow the British there. This was a frightening specter for U.S. and world imperialism. So it became impossible for them to rule in their own face, because the people had become conscious of the colonizer. And so it's indirect rule. They give you a formal, they sit down at a table with you, help you draw up a constitution, and then formally have this great flag-raising event. Play
nationalism,
and then they sail off in the sunset, but they still own the economy.
Yes.
Who owns the economy of Egypt? Look at who owns that economy. Who owns the economy of all over? You find that all over Africa and throughout the rest of the world. And so they control us by being able to control our economy. Look at Africa, the richest continent on earth in terms of natural resources, but Africans are the most impoverished people on the planet Earth. And it's not because the resources aren't there, and it's not as quiet as it's kept. It's not because Africans are stupid and white people are smart. It's because the gun has imposed a certain rule on Africa. And then you have, and not just Africa, of course, because if you look at what's happening throughout the world, what is the basis for there being a NATO today? There's no longer a Soviet Union. So what is the NATO that was formed to deal with it?
This is the white Western jihadist.
It is.
It's really a jihadist power. That the only power that allowed to be extremist.
Yes, and so they go to Libya. They use AFRICOM, and then the NATO, plays a major role through a desperate France. Because if France doesn't have Africa, what does it have? I mean that in a literal sense of the word, because
croissant.
Croissant.